Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, we had a declination last week with the Boston Consulting Group, and it had some really interesting points. But one of the reasons I wanted to visit with you about this is I wrote what I thought was a fairly plain Jane vanilla blog about it. I followed you, and I have to shout out Dylan Toker at the Wall Street Journal for quoting Mary Shirley in his piece. And the blog posts went crazy over the weekend. So people are interested in this case. People are listening. Why should they be listening to this declination?
I think it's interesting because this declination had some real teeth in it for what the offending company, Boston Consulting Group, which I guess goes by the name BCG colloquially, they took some really substantive action on the remediation side. And we can talk about that. Also, of course, we don't get many declinations publicly. We're glad to see them, but this is only the second one in 2024 that we've seen at all. And I do think compliance officers appreciate the opportunity to understand how a company avoided prosecution. And also, Boston Consulting Group, while the corruption here was focused, there was only one country involved or one country unit of BCG. It seemed to be fairly I don't know if I want to say egregious, but like this was clear corruption. I mean, they were absolutely engaging in this. There were some real red flags here, and Boston Consulting Group then cleaned it up, and now they've avoided prosecution. So, for everybody who has ever said, we would love the Justice Department to explain more about why, when somebody does corruption, they don't get prosecuted for it. What is the rationale for that? This is that example in that declination. I got a lot of action from it too when I posted. Dylan Dokar did not quote me, but even though I beat them on story by a day, but whatever. And yeah, it's a good meaty thing for compliance officers to sink their teeth into.
Matt, we almost always bury the lead here on Compliance Into the Weeds, but you opened with a lead. So I'm going to ask you to maybe take a step back and, to the extent possible from the short declination letter, give our audience the background facts to this case.
Sure. This, broadly speaking, is nothing we have not heard before here in anti-corruption land. But Boston Consulting Group, which is a large global firm, privately held, does about 12.3 billion in revenue a year. Their Portugal unit were the ones who were the culprits here, that roughly from 2011 to 2017, employees in the BCG Portugal unit were working with an agent in the African country of Angola to try and score government contracts in Angola. They had paid that agent over the course of those 6 years or so 4.3 million in commissions to win these contracts, which were worth in total, there were 11 contracts, which were worth a total of $22.5 million, which netted Boston Consulting 14.4 million in ill-gotten gains. And of course, the structure of these commissions here is important to know that the agent was going to receive roughly 20 to 35% fixed commission on whatever it was that he was bringing in. This is, of course, a risky arrangement because that means for the agent, the bigger the contract, the more money I get, the more temptation there is, therefore, to try and bribe the government officials to give us a big contract, which is pretty much what happened. And then the 4.3 million in commission that the agent was receiving, that went to three separate offshore accounts. And come on, folks, we all know what was really going on here is that the offshore accounts were back channels to put bribes into the government officials' pockets. Like I said, we have seen all this before. Offshore accounts, very risky, temptation prone sales commission structure for the agents, a high corrupt country in Angola. Like, okay, that's that. But then we can get on to what Boston Consulting Group did to avoid prosecution. Ultimately, they did also need to pony up 14.4 million in disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, the profit they got from those. But those are the facts of the case. But the broad contours of it, like I said, we have heard that many times before.
Well, Matt, I'd like to go into the 7 factors listed in the letter for the reasons listed by the DOJ as to why they received the declination. I'm not going to read them straight through, but I want to highlight them. And then when we finish, maybe you and I can take a little bit of a deeper dive into them. Number one was the voluntary and timely self disclosure. Two was full and proactive cooperation. Three was the nature and seriousness of the offense. Four was timely and appropriate remediation. Five was significant improvements to the compliance program. Six was the absence of aggravating circumstances, leading me to conclude it probably was not U.S. management involved. And then seven, CG agreed to disgorge. But there's actually a lot in there that I wanted to unpack with you. And can we start with the timely and voluntary self disclosure of the misconduct? What did you see there that so intrigued you?
It intrigued me because we don't know exactly what timely means here. So, Boston Consulting Group did somehow discover this. They apparently found reference to bribery in an email from 2014. I don't know. The letter does not say, does that mean they found it in 2014? Were they doing a look back for some reason and then were sifting through 2014 emails and found it several years later? We're not clear on any of that, but you're right that the letter does say they had a timely self disclosure. Was that a couple of weeks after they figured out that we have a bribery problem in Portugal? Was it several months later? Hard to say. Tom, the borders, the frames, the bookmarks of disclosure that I've seen in FCPA that stick out in my mind, I can remember Cognizant Technology, when they had an FCPA settlement several years ago, they won credit for disclosing it within weeks of finding out that they had a big bribery problem in India. And they got a lot of credit for that. So at the shortest end, timely means a couple of weeks. At the longest end, we had a enforcement action last year. I don't remember the company exactly, so I'm not going to guess at them here, but they had waited, I thought it was 18 months before they self-disclosed. And the Justice Department said, okay, that's not timely. So somewhere between 2 weeks and 18 months, historically, timely was in there. But Tom, I do think that one important thing for compliance officers to remember today is the Justice Department's newly announced awards program does, I think, kind of telegraph a message to us that these days, timely self disclosure is 120 days. Because if a whistleblower brings a matter to you first, company, and then they go to the Justice Department and they report the same matter to regulators, you, company, could still get voluntary self disclosure credit if you report it within 120 days of that whistleblower first bringing it to you. As a practical matter, these days, I think timely is 120 days or less. I don't know if it's going to be 2 weeks like Cognizant. I don't know if it's going to be somewhere else there. And we certainly don't know what it means with Boston Consulting. What did they actually do? What was timely? But there's been a lot of discussion in the compliance world about what timely self disclosure is. I am not a lawyer. I am not giving anybody counsel. I am simply reading the tea leaves I see, which to me point to 120 days or less is now timely self disclosure. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on the timely variable there, Tom.
The company that had 18 months between discovery and disclosure was self disclosure was Albemarle. And we really do need some, I think, specific guidance. At 120 days in the corporate world, that's less than a blink of an eye. It's going to, I think, put a lot more pressure on internal whistleblowing, on internal hotlines, on internal speak up, on triaging, on investigating, on making the decision and getting the call right. I think it's going to put even more pressure, regardless, I shouldn't say regardless of whether you self disclose or not, but you've got to get that timing down and you have to make a decision quickly and efficiently. The next point, Matt, was the full cooperation. And the part that intrigued me in the declination letter was not that they announced or revealed all relevant facts, but they identified the individuals. And I think that's one more specific signal from the Department of Justice that they want companies to name names. Anything in that prong that caught your eye or interested you?
There was a lot that interested me in how Boston Consulting handled the offending employees. So within that big headline, the declination letter also outlined a couple of sub steps of remediation about how they handled these offending employees. We don't know how many there were, but they fired the offending employees. They withheld the bonuses of these employees. They denied access to, quote, financial transition normally given to Boston consulting employees leaving the firm. I'm going to guess that's a fancy way of saying they docked them severance pay. Maybe there's some other sort of outplacement services or something that they were also getting. But basically, the offending employees got fired and didn't get a cent to help them out the door. But Tom, what really jumped out to me also was that Boston Consulting required the implicated partners to give up their equity in the firm. And that is a big deal for a lot of consulting firms out there and the senior managing partners and whatnot. They've spent years at the firm. They build up a lot of equity in the firm that is potentially worth millions of dollars. That could be your retirement plan. That could be your security for after you leave the firm. And now they don't have it. That more than anything else struck me as a draconian action. Yes, firing people leaves a black mark for their future employment. But philosophically, I looked at the loss of equity as they just wiped out everything these offending employees had ever put into the firm because that's how you get equity that's worth money and now you don't have it. Clearly, the Justice Department liked it because they talked about this a lot. And the department has talked about how it wants to see companies using clawback policies against their employees. As a matter of law and practice, I am not sure how this would have worked if Boston Consulting had been a publicly traded company, which it is not, where you might be giving people stock awards, which I think are more like property that would be harder to give up unless you had a convoluted contract for your equity awards that maybe you would surrender it if for cause. But that seems to me like that is a tricky contracting negotiation that the HR and legal teams would have to have. Point for compliance officers to keep in mind. A lot of that gets a lot easier when you're a private consulting firm and you're owned by a series of partners who have shares. And basically, these offending partners were besmirching the good name of the whole company. So I can see why the other partners would not be pleased. But more than anything else, Tom, that was what jumped out at me. Is they made them give up the equity. They made them give up a huge high value thing. And that's got to hurt.
The legal route to do that, I think, is going to be very telling going forward. I have to believe, given the paucity of information that's in the declination letter, the BCG had the contractual right to do that. The thing that struck me, Matt, that I wanted to explore a little bit with you on this point, though, was we have seen enforcement action after enforcement action where a company does something that, if not new, is different. And let me go back to Albemarle, which, to its credit, completely changed its sales strategy from third party sales agents to internal employees. And that was lauded by the Department of Justice. Well, here we have, as you have noted, equity being taken back. Does that now set a floor going forward? Does a company
I
now have to engage in draconian types of clawbacks? That was the word you used, and I have to agree with that.
I think my question here, and I would love it if there were a labor lawyer who could answer this, but if you are a privately held consulting firm where it's more like you are owned by a partnership and now several of the partners have committed a crime, that seems like a different sort of clawback exercise than you are a publicly traded company that has given equity as compensation to executives. Because the executives, they're not partners in the firm, they're just employees who also happen to own shares. And I don't know necessarily what would the distinction be there to be able to claw that back. You're right that the Justice Department has talked a lot about the importance of clawbacks and that they want to see them and they want to see them exercised. Ditto for the Securities and Exchange Commission, which also now has a rule out there about trying to exercise clawbacks if you have accounting fraud against investors and you're a publicly traded company. So very clearly, the Justice Department, the SEC, other regulators have said they want the good stuff the equity compensation, the huge bonuses, the golden parachutes and whatnot, they want that to be vulnerable if an executive commits misconduct. So the compliance team would have to think, how do we get that written into a contract? We're not the ones who are going to do that. Legal is going to be the one to do it. HR is going to be the one to insist on it with the employee during the hiring negotiations and whatnot. It will be a convoluted and complicated process. But look at the favorable resolution that Boston Consulting did by really dropping the hammer on these offending employees. I wish I knew how many employees were involved. I can't imagine that Portugal is going to be a huge office or a market for a global consulting firm. So I don't know if there's a lot of people there, but the declination implies that there were multiple people, not one person who were working with this agent. I don't know what else to say other than, this is the sort of thing that the department seems to be talking about a lot as this is good. This is what we want. And it's all about getting equity compensation back. It's all about getting rid of bonuses. It's all about getting rid of severance pay. It's about scaring the living daylights out of executives who would have a lot to lose if they commit misconduct. That clearly is what the department wants to see so that executives will be less inclined to go ahead and commit misconduct.
Do you think this will influence declinations or rather other enforcement actions down the road? Or do you think it's because of the unique factual circumstances just going to apply to Boston Consulting Group?
I'm not sure. Certainly, you could craft hiring agreements and employment contracts that have a lot of language about clawing back equity compensation for misconduct. However, we should also notice that for public companies, a lot of executives who might commit the misconduct, I'm not clear that they'd have a lot of equity compensation. If you're a managing partner at a consulting firm, a global consulting firm, you've got a lot at stake. You have equity in that firm and it's worth a lot of money. But if you are a publicly traded behemoth and the person committing the FCPA violations is a deputy sales manager in a far-flung jurisdiction, I'm not sure that they have a lot of equity compensation. So what would you be clawing back from them? What if they don't get any at all? You can't claw back stuff that they've never received. So I do sometimes wonder, how far could you take this idea? It's a lovely idea. And docking bonuses, denying severance pay, that also seems pretty standard, but that is standard. I've seen plenty of instances where an employee was fired for cause. No, they didn't get severance. They didn't get any sort of unemployment benefit. But for the huge frauds we're talking about, then you would need I'm not sure that there's a lot of executives out there who would have a lot of skin in the game at publicly traded companies. Private companies, it's a different ballgame. Hard to say.
Matt, in the section on remediation, there were 2 points that interested me. The first was that the company would establish local and global risk committees. And the second was develop guidelines for opening offices in new and emerging markets. Uh, Global Risk Committee is not something that's particularly new, but I was interested that they are also pushing compliance down to create a local risk committee, whether that's a geo region, business unit, it's not made clear. And then also specific guidelines around opening in new markets. Any thoughts on those?
Um, Actually, if I could shift gears a little bit, I was more intrigued by what wasn't said in this other remediation part here, is that it didn't expressly say, not in the declination or in the statement that Boston Consulting put out, they didn't actually say whether they scrapped those incentive-based contracts with agents, which other companies that have been sanctioned for FCPA violation lately, they have disposed of those incentive-based compensation agreements with agents for good reason, because those are very tempting vehicles for corruption, that sort of arrangement. And I am not clear on if Boston Consulting actually did that. As for all the other stuff they did, more training for employees, sure, heard that before. More due diligence protocols for vendor onboarding and client due diligence, sure, we've heard that. The metrics or the guidelines for opening new offices, I think that all makes sense. I wonder what the process was before this. I think it does underline the importance of establishing policy and process for all of this in writing. Um, I suspect with a company as big as, or a firm as big as Boston Consulting, sure, they had a process for opening new offices. I do not know if they had something that was written down, they had a formula that could be turnkey, or was it more just institutional knowledge about how to do this? Whatever the answer is for Boston Consulting, I do think that relying on institutional knowledge for how we do things at a large company, that's risky unto itself. That's risky in all sorts of ways, well beyond corruption risk. It really does help to have written down policies and fixed procedures that require executive management to sit down and think, how do we actually want this to work? Long before any specific crisis comes along to say, oh crap, we need to figure out a new way to do this right now. That's a terrible time to invent a better way to open a foreign office. As far as it goes, I think the lesson here is that a lot of companies it would behoove them to write down these sort of policies for all of this stuff. How do you deal with clients? How do you enter new markets? How do you deal with high risk parties? How do you handle agents? Put it in writing, have it fixed, have it clear so that any deviation from those will also, by the way, stick out like a sore thumb. And that sore thumb would then be mighty useful to have if there's an investigation and regulators are asking, why did you do that thing 4 years ago in that market over there that was a deviation from your policy? In a perfect world, you'd have documented why, but the more you can formalize these processes, the more deviations from them will stick out like a sore thumb. Then you can look into it. Better you do it than the regulator does.
Man, I think it turns out there's quite a bit of information in this declination, and I'm going to be very interested to see how the DOJ may parse this out in enforcement actions going forward.
Thank you, Tom.